Anna, should we start by talking about maternal love as a subcategory of human love? What is the relationship between maternal and romantic love in terms of our evolutionary history?
So maternal love is the first love, essentially. So maternal love is the one that evolved first, and that was to bond together mothers and their infants, because obviously before really the mammals evolved, infants were based in eggs, and mothers didn't really have input into their care. So as we all know, you as a mother, me as a mother, whilst we love our children, they can be very difficult. They can be hard to cope with. And so love evolved to bind a mother to her slightly troublesome children, to make sure that she stuck around and that she cared for them when they needed caring for. So that was the very first love. Romantic love comes quite late in the day, actually, at about 500,000 years ago. And that was only because in humans, that was the time when fathers became involved in caring for their children. And at that point, you need to bind together fathers and mothers for sort of a greater or lesser period of time, basically, to make sure they stick around and look after their children. So evolutionarily, they're actually quite distantly related.
But are they qualitatively similar? Do they feel, is romantic love supposed to feel like maybe a slightly more diluted form of what's the relationship sort of hormonally between the two of them?
It's really hard. Yeah, I can explain to you from a very, very objective point of view. Well, how things feel is something that science will never touch, to be honest. So, but yes, in some ways they're similar. They use exactly the same neurochemistry, for example. So, and human love is underpinned by the same neurochemistry, regardless of what the focus of that love is. So they have the same neurochemistry. They have similar neural activation, apart from, obviously, romantic love involves the sex hormones. And there are some areas of the brain which light up in relation to maternal love more powerfully or in slightly different places based upon that sort of nurturing area of love, and also the need for risk detection when you're a parent, so the need to detect risk in the environment. So they look slightly different on a scanner screen, but from a neurobiological point of view, they're actually the same.
That risk detection thing, this is when mothers get anxious, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So so the risk detection bits, it's based in the amygdala, and it's that inbuilt thing where you don't necessarily know you're doing it, but you scan the horizon pretty much constantly, looking for threats to your offspring that you can protect them from. So, and it's exactly the same in fathers. Actually, both fathers and mothers have quite a heightened risk awareness sensation, basically.
Although anecdotally, mums seem to check their kids are breathing more than dads do when they're like way beyond the SIDS phase. I still check my 3-year-old is breathing before I go to bed. And my
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not aware of the science on that and whether there is a difference. But certainly, I think mothers are probably a little bit more. I don't know whether it's attuned to that, but I certainly used to do that more. We do know that sort of slightly obsessive checking behaviour in parents is underpinned by oxytocin. So if as a parent you have quite high levels of oxytocin, which in many ways is really helpful. One of the downsides of it, unfortunately, is that you become slightly more, not OCD, that's the wrong term, but you become slightly more obsessed with checking behaviours, things like checking is the baby breathing, that kind of thing.
A friend of mine warned me before having my first that you will do things as a new mother that would have you diagnosed with OCD in the other circumstance.
Completely. I became completely bonkers at one point. I became obsessed with the temperature in my daughter's room and the fact that the radiator was, dodgy or something like that. So I spent, a lot of time checking the temperature. You do. I think it's just that particularly, I think with your first child, you become, because you're not aware of detecting those risks and it's a new thing for you, I think you become much more aware of possible risks in the environment. I don't know, anecdotally again, I think from your second one onwards, you're slightly less aware of risk, maybe.
Mums now have an acronym for this, PFB, the precious first baby.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Well, I had a friend who had a motto saying number 3 A&E because she had a third one, and by that time she was like, yeah. So she spent a lot of time in A&E.
A&E visits aside,
yes.
Am I right in thinking that maternal love is more intense for humans than for other species?
No, actually, we're not. The difference between love, actually, between us and other species is mainly the fact that our love has a conscious level. So most species only experience love at the unconscious level, at the emotional level. We engage our conscious brain as well, which is why we spend a lot of time contemplating our relationships and thinking about them and dwelling on them and daydreaming about them and, worrying about how to maintain them and all that kind of thing. So we have a conscious element. I wouldn't necessarily say, and again, it's very difficult to tell intensity of love, because when I say I feel love and when you say you feel love, we have no idea if what we're talking about is the same ballpark in terms of intensity of feeling. Because whilst you get an intensity of an activation on a scanner screen, you can't, whilst you can compare that maybe between individuals, it's very difficult to compare between species because they're just completely different subjects. So we have no knowledge that we are more maternal than any other mammalian creature. We just have absolutely no idea. And certainly I think if you've seen some of the higher mammals, such as the apes, grieve the loss of a child, it's very hard to think that they don't experience love in the same intense way as we do.
Is it maybe that so our babies are more vulnerable though, right? So the period...
It depends on the mammal, but yes, our babies, what's different about our babies is they're what's known as, a bit technical, secondarily altricial, which is rare. So there are two sorts of way of having a baby. You can have a precocial baby or an altricial baby. A precocial baby is what most apes have, which is baby comes out, eyes are open, ready to go, can climb the trees, that kind of thing. Okay, so precocious, it's very advanced. Then we have altricial babies, which is what dogs have, like little babies, eyes closed, really not terribly developed at all, can't move, can't do anything for themselves. That's altricial. We're this weird mix of having been a precocious ape and gone backwards. And that's because the fact that we have such enormous brains. And so our babies are born a long time before they should be. They should probably be in there for at least probably another 9 months, actually, slightly terrifyingly. And
yes.
Can you imagine?
Yes.
And,
currently 6 months pregnant. That doesn't sound very nice.
No, exactly. And so and that's because our brains are 6 times bigger than they should be. And so if we were born at full term, like the other apes, because we're bipedal, we have a very narrow pelvis, and the baby and the mummy would die, essentially. So we have evolved to birth our babies far too soon. And that's why they're so incredibly dependent and so incredibly vulnerable, because we have to birth them early. So they're actually not fully developed at all. They're not like other apes. And as a lot of people now know, we go through a period of very rapid brain development for 2 years after birth to get that brain up to where it should be. So we do have very, very dependent babies compared to the other apes. And that is why, for example, we have involved fathers, and that is why it truly does take a village to raise a human child, because they require so much input compared to other sort of monkeys and apes.
Given this unique vulnerability and also the very extended period of vulnerability that our babies have, would that not suggest, given that maternal love exists to basically encourage us to put up with a lot of nonsense, wouldn't that suggest that our maternal love might be either more intense or more extended? Does that not tell us maybe
it's probably
something?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily more intense. I would say it's more extended, certainly.
Okay.
We are the only species on the planet that has childhood and adolescence, for example. And the reason why we have childhood and adolescence rather than just going from being infant to what we call a juvenile to an adult is because we take such an incredibly long time to mature. So we have to be bonded to our kids and our teenagers for a really long time compared to other mammals. So yes, it's definitely extended. And that's why human love is so fascinating, is because it lasts such a long time. And in other species, yes, there will be some where they might have maybe 1 or 2 relationships that might last decades if the species lives that long. But we have an innumerable number of relationships that last for decades in our lives.
So just to be clear, what's the difference between us having a childhood and an adolescence, whereas other species have a juvenile period?
Okay, so there are 3 in all animals. There are 3 life history. They're called life history stages. It's to do with growth, and in most animals there are 3. It's infant, juvenile, adult. And infant goes from birth until the child is able to feed themselves. Then you have juvenile, and juvenile goes until sexual maturity, and then you have adult. We need more than that because it takes such a long time to get to sexual maturity. So we have infant, and then we have child. Child slots in when we wean our babies. So they're not independent from a dietary point of view. But we have to wean our babies early, because otherwise the human race wouldn't replace itself. So we've put in the childhood stage as well, so that we replace. We can go back as mothers, stop breastfeeding, and become fertile again. That's essentially how it is. So we put childhood in. So that goes from childhood goes from weaning to puberty, and then we put in adolescence, which goes from puberty to sexual maturity, which are two different things, and then you carry on from there, basically.
Okay. So a pubescent can feed themselves, but cannot reproduce themselves.
Essentially. So they cannot reproduce. It's only at the end of the adolescent stage when you reach what we'd call sexual maturity, and then you become an adult. Yeah.
Right. So on the, I want to get on to talking about I'm saving fathers, because obviously you have a whole book on fathers. So I want to get the mother stuff, front load the mother stuff. In terms of maternal love kicking in, you do sometimes hear about women who don't find it that easy, that there is variation in how quickly maternal love kicks in. What factors affect that? What do we know about how that is induced?
There are various reasons for that. Some of them are psychological reasons. Some of them are genetic reasons. So some of the psychological reasons might be, for example, that the process of pregnancy itself or the birth was traumatic. And trauma can definitely make it much, much harder to bond. It might be that the mother experiences postnatal depression or even prenatal depression, and that makes it much harder to bond. It can be that their own experience of being parented. So how you are parented, because of that 2 years after birth where your brain is growing like mad, that 2 years in particular builds the architecture of your social brain. And if you as a child experience not very healthy relationships during that time, unfortunately, your architecture can sometimes not be the best, your brain architecture for being in good relationships when you're an adult. So it can be some mothers suffer because their own relationships when they were developing weren't very good. And therefore they don't have the neurochemical architecture to be very good at doing this. There can also be genetic reasons. There are a set of genes that underpin your social abilities, your ability to form relationships. And there's one set of genes related to oxytocin, which affect really how sensitive you are as a parent and how easily you attach to your child as a parent. And so those, again, could impact your ability. And we just know that some people struggle more with all relationships. So again, they might have a set of genes that makes them struggle. They might have low circulating oxytocin, for example. Oxytocin is really important in the first stages of forming a bond. And if you have low circulating oxytocin, then you are less inclined and less kind of motivated to build bonds. So it could be that from a neurochemical point of view, you just find it hard to build bonds, regardless of who they're with. So there's sort of a mix of reasons why mothers might struggle. And it generally is a mix between sort of environmental, psychological factors and genetic factors. There's no sort of clear cut thing. What I would say to any parent who finds it hard to bond is you're not alone for a start. More parents than we know find it hard to bond. It's a bit of a taboo to talk about because we have this belief that, baby comes out, you get a flood of love. It's amazing. And actually, if you talk to parents confidentially, a significant number don't feel that. And sometimes don't feel that for months. And so we have to normalize that and say that's perfectly normal. That's absolutely fine. And that there are interventions, there are things we can help people do with their babies to help them do that, to help them develop the bonds. So it's not like a closed door. If you find it hard initially, that it's always going to be like that. Quite often, it will either develop on its own, or, specialists can intervene and help you and build very, very good bonds with your baby.
I want to ask what those interventions look like. But first, on this question about bonding, at the risk of sounding morbid, we do know that infanticide has been a part of human history for a long time. Is this poor bonding, in some instances, based on things like trauma, based on lack of social support? Might that lead to it as well? Are these the kind of triggers in the environment that might, in the ancestral environment, have given rise to thoughts of infanticide, and might poor bonding sometimes be an emotional prelude to that? If that makes sense.
I would say I'm not a specialist in infanticide, and I think it's something that we have to be very careful talking about, because actually the statistics on it are incredibly low. Very, very few people kill their babies. In the environment in which we evolved, actually, infanticide tended to be practiced by males who are unrelated to the baby. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that happens is because by killing if a male comes into a group, let's talk about, I don't know, gorillas. Okay. In gorillas, if a male comes into a group, sometimes he will kill the nursing babies in the group because it brings the females back into estrus. They are fertile again, and then he will be there to look after his babies because they're not his babies. That tends to be why infanticide occurs in other animals. And in humans, it's actually very, very rare. So no, I would not say probably people who commit infanticide, it's probably very unlikely to be just a lack of bonding. There will be something else going on as well.
You do read about, say, maybe Roman practices were very unusual, but there's this like period of deliberation when the baby was born for a week or two, and then the patriarch would decide whether or not to expose the baby. But anyway, that's a grim area of history. And I
think historically, you hear a lot about, the Spartans used to leave weak babies on hillsides and that kind of thing.
Yes.
They're probably very cultural reasons for that. There's not a biological reason to do that.
Okay. So on the interventions point, let's stick with mothers for the time being. When mothers are struggling to bond with their babies, what interventions might work?
Well, first of all, it's very important to try and uncover what the basis of that is. Mm-hmm. Because if it's something like trauma, then alongside intervention, you have to help the woman deal with the trauma that's preventing her. So if it's a traumatic birth or it's a difficult pregnancy or whatever, it's very important that you talk that through. And that's not my job. That's the psychologist or psychotherapist's job. Mm-hmm. When we talk about interventions, what we try to do is we try to build a secure attachment, and we try to use our knowledge of neurochemistry to help that mother produce the neurochemicals that are going to help her bond, basically. So the neurochemicals which underpin love are there to help you develop bonds. They're there to give you a hand. So oxytocin and dopamine are very important at the beginning. And they are there to kind of orientate you towards this new being in your life and block out all the other stuff going on so that you orientate towards that baby. They actually decrease some of the risk detection area so that you feel more confident looking after your baby. And dopamine motivates you to do it even when it's really, really hard, basically. And then there's another chemical known as beta endorphin, which is actually the chemical of long-term love, which underpins long-term love. And there are lots of practices that release beta endorphin. So touch releases it, laughter, dancing, exercise, singing, all these different things. So what we tend to do with parents who can't or find it hard to attach is we start to try and teach them the behaviours which will enable them to begin a bond. So there's two key things that build bonds really powerfully with parents and babies. First is touch. The second is eye gaze. So touch is very straightforward. So, for example, we might teach baby massage. We might teach, things that we can do during bath time. We might teach sort of exercises we can do in terms of singing or dancing or that kind of thing with the baby. We also have to teach some parents, and it's more often than you think actually, how to play with their baby. Because some people don't know how to play with children, and it might be they weren't played with as children themselves. Or quite often these days, the first time any of us experience a baby is when it's our own. Now that's actually quite recent for that to happen because we don't have extended families. In the past, you would have been brought up around babies. You would have known how to interact with the baby. So sometimes we have to help people do that because they don't feel confident. And, what we're talking about with play is sensitive reciprocal play. So it's about tuning into your baby's needs empathetically and giving a sort of lovely give and take flow of play, responding to their prompts, responding to their noises, responding and keeping what we call appropriate eye gaze. So eye gaze is really important. And that's why phones are troublesome around babies, because babies search for your eye gaze. They search to look into your eyes. So if you're looking at your phone, for them, that's very alienating. So we try to teach good eye gaze. And it's a very slow process. But by teaching people how to produce these things through touch, by teaching people how to play with their baby, to really tune in and really get that reciprocity and that sensitivity and that real understanding of where the baby's going, that helps to build that bond. And it's slow, but it starts to really, and the joy of it is when you get to a certain point, because you personally are getting such a neurochemical reward from it, it starts to be something that you enjoy. It's not stressful anymore. It's actually enjoyable, and it's quite addictive, actually. So it's about getting over that hump, and then people tend to be okay. But it's about supporting people to find their way of interacting with their baby that's going to produce these chemicals and produce this bond.
I guess breastfeeding is a shortcut to much.
Breastfeeding is a shortcut. There is an advantage to breastfeeding in bonding because it produces oxytocin and it produces beta endorphin. And so it's a very hormone heavy procedure to do. What I will say is that's only the case if you don't find breastfeeding stressful. If you find breastfeeding stressful, then what you actually end up with is a mummy full of cortisol and a baby full of cortisol. And that's not a good thing for bonding. So I'm very much an advocate of doing what is appropriate for you and your baby. If breastfeeding is something that you find very nice and natural and easy, and, you know, it takes time for everyone to establish it. But if once you've established it, that's something you really love to do, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And it is a bit of a head start when it comes to bonding. If you can't do it for whatever reason, then there are other things you can do. And even feeding with a bottle, okay, you're not going to get the neurochemical hit because you're not letting down milk, you're not doing all those sorts of things, but you're still touching, you're still often eye gazing. That stare that a baby gives to you when you're feeding, that's still a very powerful experience, even if you're bottle feeding. So I always just, I find it, I think parents have enough pressure on them as it is without then saying you've got to do this because this is the best thing to do. I think what's the best thing to do is what is the best thing for you and your baby's relationship.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Does the baby get cortisol from stressful feeding because there's cortisol in mum's milk, or because the baby's producing it? Him or
baby
herself
produces it because babies are very sense-based beings, and they're very good at sensing stress, essentially. So it's their own cortisol. It's not the mum's cortisol, no.
Am I right that they can smell? They have this amazing sense of smell when they come out, so they can smell who their mum is, for instance.
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, when babies come out, their vision is awful. So, and like, you know, we're very visual animals, but actually when a baby's born, so what they are relying on is they're relying on touch, they're relying on smell, and they're relying on their hearing. And their hearing is also very good. The hearing develops quite early in the womb. And that's why we always say to parents, talk to your baby, sing to your baby, do all those sorts of things, because when they come out, they will look for your voice because they know what your voice is. And yes, they can smell you. And that's why, you know, skin-to-skin contact is very important, because if you put them on you, they can really get that very close sensory experience.
Why has evolution favoured smell and hearing, do you think, in newborns and not vision?
Probably. And again, I'm not especially in the sentence, but the visual cortex is massive.
You're right.
And it probably isn't fully developed when they come out.
It would just be too big and costly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have to wait till you come out, really, for your visual cortex to completely be done. So olfaction and hearing develop again quite early on, and our olfactory area of our brain compared to other mammals is tiny. So I imagine, though, don't quote me on it, I imagine it's just because the visual cortex is so massive. Right.
And we have this difficult problem as a species that we have big brains, small pelvises relatively.
Yes. So we kind of, some stuff has to wait till after you're born.
Yeah. I always think that this, Genesis is like true in a symbolic sense in this way, right? That in order to stand up and have our hands, in order to have knowledge of good and evil, our big brains, women have to bring forth babies in pain.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, the downside of being us, well, there's quite a lot of downsides of having a big brain, but one of them is of being bipedal and having a big brain, which is what's seen as dominate the world. The massive downside of it is how incredibly difficult human childbirth is. Because when you see any other ape give birth, it's not difficult at all. So we have really made it difficult for ourselves to do this. It's actually much, much more risky in humans than any other species.
And I guess that has social ramifications in terms of women needing help to give birth.
Yes.
Women do sometimes give birth on their own, but it's not advisable.
No.
I guess in the ancestral environment, you would have help of some kind, generally from other women.
Completely. I mean, the reason why our species survived in the first instance, again, with these very dependent little babies, is because of female kin helping each other. So long before dads came into the picture, female kin would help each other first. And that would be around childbirth, and that would be around babysitting and caring and passing on the knowledge of how to raise this very dependent baby. So yes, I mean, female kin were in a way the first midwives, I suppose. They would have been the ones that would help each other.
Should we move on to dads? This seems like the moment. So talk to me about that evolutionary moment when, I mean, I say moment, enormously long period of time, when dads become modern dads, when we develop that really strong investment.
Yeah. So that evolved about 500,000 years ago. And the reason why it happened at that point was, again, entirely due to the big brain situation, is up until about 500,000 years ago, we had big brains. But up until that point, female kin helping each other to raise children seemed to be enough. And then about 500,000 years ago, our brains took another massive increase in size to around where they are today. And at that point, women couldn't support each other and deal with these even more dependent babies when they came out, and the even bigger extended childhood, adolescence dependency that they were left with. And so at that point, you turn to sort of the next genetically related person, and that's the dad, essentially. So human fatherhood evolved about 500,000 years ago. And it evolved really because, the species would not have survived without it. So the start of my book, The Life of Dad, the first line is, "It's a little known fact, fathers saved the human race." And they did, because if they hadn't stepped in, we would have died out. Because the women alone could simply not have dealt with this massive developmental problem that they had in terms of replacing the population, but also being pregnant or breastfeeding and trying to keep these incredibly dependent toddlers and children and adolescents all fed and all protected. No contraception, nothing like that. Quite a difficult environment to live in. And having to feed everybody and protect everyone. So dad stepped in at that point, and he is very, very rare, actually, human fathers. So only 5% of mammals have investing fathers. We are the only ape that has one. And it evolved because of the fact that our children are so dependent and need somebody else to stick around. But what's lovely about it as a role is it didn't evolve to duplicate mum's role. So it wasn't that we just got another male mummy to help out. Dads have a very specific way of parenting, and they have a very specific role, and that contributes to and complements mum's role. So the baby gets this really nice developmental environment with slightly different inputs from mum and dad, which is what's really nice.
So just to clarify, this transition 500,000 years ago, did we go from dads being around, I mean, like being within the same band and contributing to protection and to food provision, but not being hands-on, right? Not doing directive care?
What would have happened about 500,000 years ago, we would have been in what's known as a multi-male, multi-female group, which is like chimpanzees. And what would have happened was, so the males were around, but the males would have basically been around because the women were around. And that's what happens with primates. Males map onto females because that's where the reproduction is. Actually, the males don't do anything. They will defend the group because they will defend the females, but they won't provision the group.
Oh.
They don't provision. That's not what they do. So what would have happened before that point is that the females would have helped each other with provisioning.
Okay.
Basically.
And the males just feed themselves?
And the guys just feed themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. And then what happens about 500,000 years ago is that suddenly the women can't do that. It's absolutely impossible to go. And so we're at this situation where the men, and it won't be conscious and it will take thousands of years, but the men are suddenly like, oh, now if I want my genes to carry on down the generations, which is the entire point of survival as part of evolution is concerned, I'm going to have to do something because all these babies are going to die, basically, because the women can't protect and provision them anymore. So they will have gone from protecting to also provisioning, but you don't want to provision children that aren't yours. So what happens is the males will start a thing called mate guarding. So they will latch onto a particular female, and because they want to make sure that any infants she has are theirs and that any infants they're provisioning are theirs, they will constantly stick with her. And that's when we start moving from a multi-male, multi-female model to what we call sort of male-female based little families within a larger multi-female, multi-male society, which is what we are now, basically. We're a multi-male, multi-female society with little families within it. And that's what happens is that the dad has to stick with mum to make sure any offspring he's provisioning are his and that he's protecting are his. And that's where you go from. So about 500,000 years ago, we do start to see evidence, particularly in the archaeological record, of what we call home bases, for example. So we see fire and we see little fire pits, and people are starting to settle down into little family groups, because that's how the best way to raise these children, and for a male to make sure you're raising your children, nobody else's.
And I guess the big social downside to that from women's perspective is that mate guarding also comes with violence sometimes.
Possibly.
By
we
jealousy.
Can't actually know that. To be honest, it really, really depends. In some species, it can be violent. And in some species, it's not at all. It's actually very benign. So we actually have no idea what it would have been like, whether it would have been quite a benign environment or not. It really depends on environmental circumstances. And that's not something we can recreate at this point in time. So we have no idea whether it would have been coercion in terms of mate guarding, or whether it would have been something of which, everybody's perfectly happy, basically. So, like if you look at some species of primate, yes, there will have been a lot of, dragging and biting and all that kind of, and then other ones, there'll be nothing. They'll just be like, I fancy you. Yeah, hey, this is good.
What does benign mate guarding look like? How does one...
Because female, even in lesser primates, females fancy males and males fancy females, and they have personalities, and they will come together and go, yes, this is the person I want to spend time with. And that's, that's something that we see even in sort of non-sexual relationships in primates. Primates have friends. They don't just have sexual relationships. So they have an understanding of wanting to be with somebody because they happen to like the person. And so you can also see that this, you will get very... particularly in the more monogamous species of primate, you will get lovely couplings which have just never been violent. They're just very, very happy. It's quite sweet.
So paternal love, you said that it's not exactly the same, that there is a complementarity to the maternal and paternal.
So paternal, it's not that the love isn't the same. The love is definitely the same. And I think we need to get away from the idea that, for example, maternal love is more powerful than paternal love, because it's not. The role is different. And the attachment they build is slightly different. Children attach to their parents in a slightly different way, no less intensely and no less importantly, but in a different way. So the female attachment between mum and baby is based on nurture. And it's what we call quite inward looking. So it's very exclusive, and it's very much based on protection and drawing the child into you and being like, I'm going to cocoon you, and I'm going to protect you. And it's a very obviously powerful nurturing based behavior. And we see that on the scanner screen as well. So when we see a mum and baby interact with each other, the most powerful signal you will see coming from that brain is from the core of the brain, the limbic area of the brain where nurturing sits and risk detection sits. And that's where the most powerful signal is. It's a very ancient drive, essentially, because the limbic area is the most ancient area of the brain. It's unconscious. When we look at dads, they're nurturing, they're just as good at nurturing, and also very good at risk detection. But on top of that, they have a thing called challenge. And what challenge is they use the fact that they have a secure attachment to their child to then challenge the child to take risks and, you know, go out into the world and fail and pick themselves up and dust themselves off. And we often see this anecdotally with fathers. So some of the fathers I follow, whenever you're sort of seeing the way that the mums interact with the baby and the dads interact with the baby, dads are always more focused on pushing the developmental boundaries. So they're kind of like, okay, we've done that bit. So now we're going to try the next bit and we're going to push it and we're going to see if this child will walk or well, you know, babble or well do whatever it is or feed itself or whatever it might be. And they kind of have this focus on, yes, sort of stimulating development and pushing forward. And it's a very important role because, as I say, it complements mum's role. So you've got this amazing nurturing presence. And you do have a nurturing presence in dads, but it's a nurturing presence with a purpose, which is, I'm actually going to make sure that you can be independent, because you need to be independent to survive and you need to be resilient. And so when we look at all the data, regardless of which father we look at around the world, that's their focus. They do it in different ways, but that's their focus. I need to make you an independent being who will survive in this world. And the world's a pretty scary place. So we're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to learn to deal with risk and deal with challenge and deal with failure. And so they are really the parent of resilience to a certain extent.
Does that instinct towards pushing the child developmentally, does that mean that fathers tend to be a bit more risk tolerant?
Oh, yeah.
I know my husband lets our son do things in the playground that I don't let him do.
Yeah, they are definitely more. I mean, it's a bit of a stereotype, I suppose, but yes, they generally, on average, are more risk tolerant. They will think that something is more acceptable than, you know, than mum does. And that's within them. That just seems to be an innate thing that they are much more open to. I mean, that's why we tend to see dads being the ones that do sort of the really rough and tumbly type play with children rather than mums. Mums do it. We have seen mums do it, but it's a feature which is much more regular in dads than it is in mums.
That was going to be my next question. What's the point of rough and tumble play? What's it for?
Rough and tumble play is incredibly important. And actually, when people come to me after talks and say, particularly dads, and say, what's like the one thing I can do with my baby that's really important? I will say, you have, you know, if you can, because not all dads like rough and tumble play, most do, but some don't, go and play with them. Go and play with them, do rough and tumble play, you know, that completely mad sort of play where you throw them around the room and you tickle them and you wrestle and you aeroplane them and you jump on the sofa and, you know, or they swing from the ceiling, whatever it might be. And that's what you do with your baby. And it's important, very, very important for two reasons. It's important in terms of bonding for dads and children, because mums who give birth definitely get a head start in bonding, because if you think birth is full, oxytocin is released to actually induce labour, to induce letdown of milk. You've got dopamine going on there. You've got beta endorphin going on there. It's like a massive bonding cocktail. And so mums do get a head start when it comes to bonding. Dads can only develop a bond with their child through interaction. And that's quite hard to do early on with a baby, particularly if mum is breastfeeding, because babies tend to be quite mother focused early on. So it's very hard initially. But when they get to about 6 months old, onwards, you can start to do this silly sort of play where you see fathers do. And it's great because it's so physical and it involves touch and it involves sort of reciprocity of social give and take. It releases loads of bonding chemicals, beta endorphin, oxytocin, dopamine. And because it's very fast and very intense, it tends to produce those in like massive tidal waves, which is great. And particularly we see it a lot in the West because we're time poor. Dads are time poor in the West. And so it's a really efficient way of building a bond. So that's the first reason. Second thing, it's developmentally very important, actually. As I said, dads are kind of the father. We always say they scaffold the child's entry into the world beyond the family, which is basically means they are the path leading to the world, the social world that you have to get used to and you have to understand how to operate in it to succeed as a human. And it's kind of a crash course in social behaviour because it's reciprocal, it's give and take. So you have to know about give and take. You have to not push it too far. If you push it too far, it's not fun anymore. It's just painful and dangerous. So you have to become very good at reading the other person, using empathy to read the other person and go, are they still enjoying this? Have I gone too far? Is this no longer fun? So it teaches empathy, it teaches challenge, and it teaches risk because it's quite challenging behaviour. It's quite scary. And therefore you have to learn to deal with that. And so it's developmentally incredibly important as well. And I think we underestimate how important play is in child's development. It's incredibly important.
This point about the importance of the hormone cascade, the various different hormones, do clinicians ever try and do this artificially if you have some difficulty bonding? No, you can't inject oxytocin or something.
No, there have been a lot of there's been research around it. Mm-hmm. The only one that could possibly be administered would be oxytocin, mm-hmm. because oxytocin is synthesized, and as I've said, it's used to induce labor. So we do have access to synthetic oxytocin, and certainly in research studies, it is used to induce social behavior to see whether, what its effects are. So we have it in a clinical form where you can squirt it up your nose, essentially, and it induces social behavior. The problem it has is it doesn't induce social behavior in absolutely everybody.
Interesting.
And it would be fine if it did nothing to some people, fine, but unfortunately it does the opposite to some people. So some people have a genetic predisposition when given synthetic oxytocin to actually become quite aggressive and potentially violent. It's very weird. And so we couldn't just willy-nilly administer it to people. So it's actually much better that we teach parents how to generate their own endogenous bonding chemicals through touch, through eye gaze, through play, through all these massage, through all these sorts of things, because we know then that that's going to be fine.
I'm glad I asked. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's something about squirting oxytocin up people's noses which isn't predictable.
Is there any relationship between, you mentioned earlier that some people just have more circulating oxytocin, like find it easier to make relationships with people, including their own babies. Is there any relationship between that and someone's propensity to have an adverse reaction to synthetic?
No, there isn't. It's a completely different gene.
Interesting.
So we really don't understand why it's a different, well, it's the same gene actually, but it's a different point on the gene that affects it. So it doesn't seem to be related at all between the two. We don't really understand why yet, why it happens in some people, apart from they seem to carry this particular point mutation, which means that it has the opposite effect than what it's supposed to.
But not to endogenous.
But not endogenous.
Interesting. No. You mentioned that Westerners do more rough and tumble play, Western dads. Why is that? What does it look like in other cultures?
In other cultures, they don't have to do it, actually, because in other cultures, particularly in cultures which spend a lot of time in the presence of their children, they have much, much longer to bond with their children. So, for example, I'm thinking of some of the hunter-gatherer societies where you wouldn't really, I mean, you see them play with their children, but it's not really rough and tumble. It's much more gentle, but that's because quite often a child will spend a lot of time actually in physical contact with their father during the day. So they are producing oxytocin and beta endorphin just by being carried around or just by being chatted to whilst everyone sits around talking, or, so in a way they don't need it because they don't need this very efficient, because they just are in contact with their children much, much more than our Western dads get to be, essentially. And so it does seem to be something that's developed more in Western populations. And we don't know, I doubt, I'm not a play specialist, I doubt there's a genetic predisposition to doing it or not. I think it's probably something that we've picked up and just seems to have become something that we do in our culture, which is passed down. And that's what dads do.
Right, that it's just a very efficient cultural strategy.
Very efficient cultural strategy, yeah.
Interesting. And what happens when children don't have this? What happens when children don't have some kind of, whether it's rough and tumble play or more extended exposure to their dads?
Well, several things happen. First of all, for example, let's say you don't have a father, so you might be a single mother, you might just not have the presence of a father in your life. What we would see, and unfortunately single mothers haven't really been studied very much, it's a bit of a shame actually. What we see in families where, for example, you don't have a mum, so let's talk about gay dads, okay? So I've studied gay dads, and what happens with gay fathers where there isn't a mother figure is the primary caretaking gay dad, it's amazing, you see it in his brain. When we put him in a scanner interacting with his child, both, I don't like calling them this, but both the mum bit and the dad bit light up. And it's kind of like his brain, the human brain is immensely plastic. And what has happened is he has actually taken on both roles. So he will commit and he will give what the mother gives in terms of the deep nurturance and the sort of pushy bit. Now, I imagine a similar thing would happen in single mothers, actually, because human babies are so precious and so intense that the human brain has evolved to make sure that even if one of those parents isn't there, that baby will hopefully get the full developmental run. They might not get rough and tumble play. That's okay. There are other ways to bond. And that's what I say to some fathers, because some fathers really don't like rough and tumble play. And that's fine. There's no problem with that. You just have to find some way of doing something with your child. And also what I always find very interesting is how we define fathers, because, you know, in the West, we have a very narrow definition of who dad is, and it's generally the biological dad. So when we say dad is absent, we are talking about the biological dad. But actually, quite often in a child's life, they will have many other people who are father figures. And that's something we can learn from non-Western populations. If you look at fathering around the world, our obsession with the biological dad's a bit weird, to be honest. In many societies, actually, it will be a social father who is the father of the child. And that might be a grandfather, an uncle, a brother, you know, a friend, whatever it might be, somebody within the community. Or some lucky children get whole teams of dads. So the dad job is divided up between various people in the family or various people in the community. And while biological dad is there, he's just one part of it. And it's that whole idea of the community raising the child. So the fact that we've got this very narrow definition, I think even in the West, when you look at a child, and actually the best thing to do is ask a child and say, who are the important men in your life and what do they do for you? Quite often they will list quite a lot of things. And actually, for those of us who study it, we would read it and go, well, yeah, that person has got a dad in their life. It's just not the biological dad. And so we have to be a little bit careful, I think, about saying that children don't have fathers, because what we mean is they don't have contact with their biological father. But quite often they will have somebody else.
I guess there's a limit to the extent that, say, teachers can play that role completely, because we wouldn't, because it's just, they don't see the children during the holidays and so on, but also because teachers doing rough and tumble play is tricky. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.